capitalism, all of the gains in automation, it goes to the owner class. All you have to do is have everyone be an owner, and now suddenly any gain in automation is a gain for everybody. If you grow just one thing, it may not grow as well as if it grows with another thing. A good example of that is called the Three Sisters method of farming.
There is definitely multi-apartment buildings or multi-families that do passive design.
$100 million that they gave to Joe Rogan that they would kind of be out if they breach contract. Is that a bigger number? Or is 2 billion a bigger number?
I don't know, Zach.
It's a tough one. I
It's
know.
really hard.
And maybe comparing numbers is not Jeremy's strong suit. Gotta go kill a Jenny.
I still don't think you should kill her. I don't think it's a good idea.
It's a ghost, dude. Welcome back, everybody, to Bread Theory. Tonight, we're going to be continuing on with A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. We have just a few minutes left in Chapter 1 of the audiobook, and then we'll be moving on to Chapter 2. So far, it has been a very rough ride in some respects. It's been dealing with very heavy subject matter. Just when you think the European mind couldn't get any crueler, hey, James, good to have you. Right at the beginning. Yeah, good for you, bud. Just when you think the Europeans couldn't get any more cruel, they do something else, like literally genocide an entire nation of people in the Caribbean, or enslave and murder at will. It's some tough stuff to stomach, but it's important at the same time. It's important to know the true history of the United States, not just the stuff, the sanitized version that you find in most U.S. textbooks, where you have, if they mention much of anything about Christopher Columbus at all, it's that he traded with the natives and then went back and he was a success. I don't think I've ever seen a textbook that mentions the genocide, and I'm not using that term lightly either, the literal genocide that he committed against the Arawaks, and it sounds like other people as well, not to mention the genocides committed by Pizarro, Cortez, and many other explorers over the course of the early colonial period of the Americas. We're the next chapter is going to be it's going to be more of the same in many respects. We're going to see how the English treat the natives. I can't remember if we're at the original Jamestown colony yet. I think we are. I think we have just made it in the chapter 2, the Jamestown colony, but we're going to see how they interact with the natives going forward, and then general English policy dealing with natives. Yeah, it's ridiculous that Columbus could ever be considered a hero, or any of these guys. These guys were all murderous psychopaths who felt that they were so incredibly superior to the people that they were conquering that it was hardly like they were even the same species. In fact, they probably did not think they were the same species at all. And joining me tonight is Trisha. Looks like she is ready. Hey, Trish.
Hi.
How's it going?
Good. How about you?
Not too bad. How's your voice doing? I know it's been troubling you, but
Better. I'm not so scratchy anymore. Still a little bit, but not as bad as I was last week.
that's
And
good.
yeah, it's still a little bit rough, but getting better. Slowly
Well,
but surely.
I'm glad to hear you're on the mend at least.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, James.
So I was just doing a brief overview of the places we've been so far, the horrific genocidal places that we've covered, and given a little bit of lead into where we're at now, which I believe we had just gotten to the Jamestown colony, the first permanent European settlement in the Americas. I think that's where we're at in the chapter, if I remember right.
Sounds right. Yeah. It's It's been a couple weeks, but
Yeah, it has been. So yeah. Is there anything you want to talk about before we get going? Anything going on with
nothing I
you?
can think of. Thank you, though.
Ah, you're welcome. You're welcome. All right. Well, let's just get into the chapter then,
Okay.
and we'll bring it up here. All right.
The guilty one should be delivered up for punishment according to English law. The Indian said, quote, "It is the manner among us Indians that if any such accident happen, we do redeem the life of a man that is so slain with a 100 arms length of beads. And since you are here strangers and come into our country, you should rather conform yourselves to the customs of our country than impose yours upon us." So Columbus and his successors were not coming into an empty wilderness, but into a world which in some places was as densely populated as Europe itself, where the culture was complex, where human relations were more egalitarian than in Europe, and where the relations among men, women, children, and nature were more beautifully worked out than perhaps any place in the world.
Oops. I forgot to unmute myself. And that's not just, the trope of the noble savage speaking there. There's plenty of documentation that, there were more and less violent cultures among the Native Americans, but none of them practiced genocide on the scale that we think of, or that we've even looked at here, that the Europeans committed. There may have been certain forms of slavery, especially for like captured enemy combatants in wars and skirmishes, but there was never chattel slavery like was practiced in the United States. There was never hereditary slavery. It would be unthinkable that a person's offspring would just be by default be in bondage among any Native American tribe that I'm aware of.
Right. From what I understand, it was more of, like you were saying, like a prisoner of war type thing. Or if somebody had a severe debt to repay, you know? And I don't mean monetarily. I mean, like if they ended the life of somebody whose skills were absolutely needed in the community, things like that. The real savages here were the European colonizers. As we've seen, their
Oh yeah,
stories, killing for pleasure.
without a question. Yeah, they're pretty bad. All right, continuing on.
They were people without a written language, but with their own laws, their poetry, their history kept in memory and passed on, in an oral vocabulary more complex than Europe's, accompanied by song, dance, and ceremonial drama. They paid careful attention to the development of personality, intensity of will, independence and flexibility, passion and potency, to their partnership with one another and with nature. John Collier, an American scholar who lived among Indians in the 1920s and 1930s in the American Southwest, said of their spirit, quote, "Could we make it our own, there would be an eternally inexhaustible earth and a forever lasting peace." Unquote. Perhaps there is some romantic mythology in that. But the evidence from European travelers in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, put together recently by an American specialist on Indian life, William Brandon, is overwhelmingly supportive of much of that myth. Even allowing for the imperfection of myths, it is enough to make us question, for that time and ours, the excuse of progress in the annihilation of races, and the telling of history from the standpoint of the conquerors and leaders of Western civilization. So ends Chapter 1 of A People's History of the United States. As always, I'll go ahead and leave you with my thoughts.
Oh, I didn't realize we actually were that close. We were only a few paragraphs from the end. It's just that he's got thoughts at the end. Do you want to go through his thoughts, or should we move on to the next chapter?
Either way works for me.
All right. Well, let's see what this person has to say about it.
There's, first of all, excellent work, in my humble opinion. Howard Zinn is obviously a classic. This is my first time reading this particular work, though. So this is very off the cuff. I think one of my first criticisms is that it is pretty rough to be reading a history of Native Americans as written here by a white American descended from settler colonialists, but who's writing on, via a degree earned from a university built on stolen land by the very stealers of that land. And there is a bit of, even Howard Zinn puts it this way, mythologizing this idyllic, perfect past, which, in terms of post-colonial thought, is not ideal. You don't want to look back and say, oh, yes, Native American society was utopian. Because utopia is not really what it was. There were conflicts and hardships, and you don't want to erase that and pretend that as they say in social justice, there are no perfect victims. But the problem isn't that Europe wiped out a utopia. The problem is that Europe wiped out a people. By wiped out, I should clarify, there are still Native Americans. They're not entirely killed, but not for lack of trying, the Europeans, let's say, devastated populations. I mean, we're talking in the 90, 95, 99 percentiles. It's unbelievable, the scope of the bloodshed. Utopian or not, that is a horrible, horrific crime whose consequences echo even into today, and will echo beyond today. I like that Howard Zinn outlines a lot of the accomplishments and achievements and progress and civilizational, advancements happening in the Americas, Central America and South America and North America as well, to sort of counter this European narrative in the history books of civilization coming to the Americas via Europeans and progress, which is an argument you still hear today. Yes, well, we wouldn't have the things we have today without these settlements. And perhaps not, and who can say what a butterfly effect, we're dealing with there. But Zinn shows just precisely how developed a lot, all of these civilizations were at the time of European encroachment and slaughter and bloodshed. And this is of particular interest to me. I'm from Virginia, and there, in Virginia history, when I was in elementary school, 3rd to 5th grade, somewhere in there, we learned about, Columbus. Obviously, that was super whitewashed. But, there's certainly none of the, instantly thinking about how he could subjugate the people he came across. But also, we learned about the Iroquois, but so little. I remember the Iroquois being a large civilization that built and lived in longhouses.
Yeah.
And helped provide food for the settlers until conflict arose.
That's
literally what I learned about the Iroquois in elementary school.
That's about what I learned too.
That they had a, I don't want to say communistic society, because communism is a kind of a product of Karl Marx, and obviously they developed that independently of Marx. But I would say a
collective.
The idea of public property and common ownership is an idea that I wish we lived by now.
Mm-hmm.
One of the many things.
Sure.
One of the many.
That's one of those things. Why it bothers me that people call Karl Marx the father of communism. He might have scientifically analyzed economics and sociology where they come together there and popularized the term, but as far as the practice of it, this is how indigenous tribes lived for tens of thousands of fucking years, long before Karl Marx even lived. So, truly, genuinely, this is the root of human civilization itself, of how we began to thrive and not just survive, by living collectively together and everybody making certain things that everyone in the village needed. And it wasn't a matter of, oh, we need to trade, or, oh, you have to give me some fucking piece of gold for this. It was just, oh, well, everybody needs baskets. So the people who know how to make baskets are going to make a bunch of baskets, so everybody has some for gathering.
Mm-hmm.
Things like that, of just meeting the needs of the village.
Sure. Yeah, that was much more common. And yeah, getting too hung up on what term to call one thing or another, that gets to be, not really productive usually. So yeah, it basically was the same thing that Marx was talking about, although he was, of course, coming at it from a perspective that was also largely a critique of capitalism. And if you don't have capitalism to critique, then yeah, it's not exactly the same as what Marx was talking about. So he's going to come to different conclusions because everyone is a product of what they're coming up in. That's part of the dialectic, right? So,
Right.
but yeah, I don't get too hung up on labeling things one way or another. I think it's perfectly fine to say that most Native American tribes, although not all of them, to be clear, there were empires in the Americas as well. The Aztec
The
Empire
Incans,
was
Aztecs,
an
yeah.
empire, and so yeah, I think it's more important to kind of look at the broad array of the way that natives live. But yeah, again, got to keep driving home that nothing was on the scale or to the magnitude that Europeans were doing things in terms of colonialism or
Right.
in
And
slavery or any of these things.
therein lies a huge difference too between the Incan Empire and Aztec Empire versus modern day empires, and not
Right.
even just modern day, but all through like at least European history empires. So there's a world of fucking difference. The Incas and the
True.
Aztecs weren't like going on the other side of the fucking planet and putting up
Well, that's
military
definitely true.
forts and occupying somebody else's fucking land. They simply were a collective of tribes, each of which was its own smaller collective that united. So,
Sure.
and yeah, we referred to them as an empire because it was many peoples who were all of the same lineage, joining together and going, okay, all
Oh
of our
yeah.
tribes have each other's backs.
Yeah.
Um,
I'm sure there was conquest that happened
oh
amongst
yeah,
tribes too. It's not as though they all just came into the Aztec Empire willingly, or
yeah,
were able to leave at will or anything like that. But again, like if you were in that empire and you really wanted to go somewhere else, no one was really going to be able to stop you, even if they wanted to.
yeah.
So, yeah,
And it was
wherever an Englishman went in the world or a Spaniard went in the world, they were still part of their respective empires. There was nothing they could ever do to get away with it, get away from it.
right. It was more of a swallowing of local areas around them, of like encompassing areas around them, rather than like today we see, at least, okay, right here, United States, we
Mm.
have military bases, and how many other fucking countries that
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. The,
it was
the
like,
the scale and the magnitude are incomparable. That's
yeah,
that's for sure. So yeah. So armed with my opinions. So what we're trying to do tonight is to talk about the unvarnished history of the United States. That's what a people's history of the United States is, and so that's our goal. So the past was wrong and mean. Where does the past start? Let's start with that question. Armed with my opinions. Where does the past start and where does it end? Where does the effects of one incident stop and you know everyone keep going on? Indoctrinated with them. Okay, so
oh wow,
you were forced to uh, believe exactly what they believed, or what?
right. Given no choice in the matter. And I mean, if you broke out of that and you're not interested in hearing the words of Howard Zinn and our analysis of it, what's next could be, I don't know, a different channel. You don't have to be here. Nobody's making you be here either.
Right. So that, I mean, yeah, that is what we're going to talk about tonight. So if you have
Right?
opinions on the things that are going on, or what you broke away from in this telling of history, then you're free to share them. But I mean, that is what we're going to talk about. So
Yep.
all right, continuing
This
on.
is the subject of the night.
Right.
Any things that are honest progressive that the Europeans wiped out in the name of progress. And so much about the structure and roles in Iroquois society that Howard Zinn goes over here very briefly, in comparison to how you could outline an entire society, seems extremely manageable to teach in elementary school. And yet, 25 years ago when I was in elementary school, this wasn't taught. Or when I was 12, 23 years ago, much of this was not taught to me.
Yeah, was not taught to me either.
And why not? Because we have to reckon with our own complicity as American citizens.
Okay, so let's just get this out of the way so that we can actually have real conversations. We're not talking about making anyone feel guilty or wallowing in the past or any of that sort of thing. Where there's a reason that history is important, though, right? It's not just a fun thing that we can make movies about, right? It has meaning for the present. We can look at patterns that have happened in the past and try not to repeat them or try to repeat them based on if we think they had a good outcome or not. They can still have repercussions generation after generation, especially if things are lopsided for particular groups. And even if they're less lopsided today, is still having that forced inequality for hundreds of years can have an effect on the present. It's not as though everything just goes away and everyone just gets a big reset button. Oh boy, what? That's why I said lower taxes for the less fortunate people can succeed. Right, so a graduated tax rate is a good idea. I mean, yeah. Let's also tax the rich a lot harder because they benefit from the system more than anybody for no other reason, but also so that we can have a greater platform for everyone to start from, so that so we can start to do away with these institutional inequalities. Yeah, boy, you're just gonna let's not go off on so many different tangents, though. We're talking about the history right now. You can tax the woke corporations. There's no such thing as a woke corporation. They're all capitalists. They all make their money by exploiting their workforce. So, I mean, that's a ridiculous notion just because they virtue signal in a certain way in order to move a few more units of whatever they're selling. That doesn't make them woke. And how would you even tax that?
They
But
would
that
be
doesn't.
making. Sorry to interrupt. If they were woke, they would be making the company have a completely different setup where every person who works there is equal fucking owner of it,
Right.
not doing performative bullshit that doesn't actually go anywhere.
Yeah, but really, let's try not to go off on so many tangents. I know you want to talk about all these liberals are so crazy sort of topics, but that's not what we're talking about tonight. So if you
Right.
want to have more of an open discussion about whatever's on your mind, I invite you to come to my stream on Friday mornings. When I just play video games on Friday mornings, and you can, I guess I won't be this Friday. I'm going to be working this Friday, so it's probably more going to be like Wednesday, or Thursday actually. But still, when I do my SJ Witcher series, that's the time to come in and talk about whatever's on your mind. Turn Raytheon into a co-op. I mean, every company, in order to operate, should at the very least be a worker-owned cooperative with democratic practices. So, yeah, why would that make it a worse company if it was a? Why? No, we're not going to get off on these tangents here. We're talking about history right now. So if you have stuff you'd like to say about the history that we're talking about, now's the time to say it. If you want to have these other side conversations, come back Thursday. That'll be your time for that.
Yep.
The obvious criticism here is, again, Howard Zinn's voice the best to be telling, the history of the Iroquois people or describing the structure of Iroquois society? No, it's not. Now, of course, this book is published in 1980, and at that point, it's hard to break through the publishing industry unless you're a white man. It's still hard to break through the publishing industry unless you're a white man. But there is another text that I plan on reading just independently. I don't know if I'll make an audiobook for it, but it is literally called An Indigenous People's History of the United States. You may wish to look into that if you'd like to read a more authoritative voice than Zinn's.
That'd be a good one too. I think that also is on YouTube. I think I've seen an audiobook version of that. So yeah, maybe we'll cover that sometime.
That would be awesome. That would
Hmm.
be really cool to follow this up with that at some point, you know?
So
Add the context to it.
absolutely, yeah, it'd be really good. So anyway, armed with my opinions, this is your last warning for now. I'm gonna have to silence you for a while if you're gonna keep trying to pull us into other conversations, because you're just derailing what we're trying to discuss at this point.
All right. The only thing I have to say to that is Democrats are not the left, so
Well,
take my word with it.
I explained that they were in the chat, I think, last night, and I explained that to them as well. But that's fine. Good. Save it for next time.
Obviously, the language of the book is a bit dated. Indians is not a term that has any accuracy. And Zin says in his book, too often people are given the names that their conquerors give them. Well, Zin, maybe look into it and have some consultants, like some consulting Native Americans who could maybe give you some guidance on what to say.
But on that point, he also pointed out that he chose to use the word Indian in remembrance of how stupid the white colonists were, and their complete inability to uh, understand, the world that they were, quote unquote, exploring. And so he leaves it in there as a reminder of how arrogant and also dumb the conquerors were, the conquistadors and so forth.
Put that in a footnote. It's not that hard. Anyhow, I was planning on making this the first 3 chapters, but it seems that the first chapter is plenty long. That's going to do it for me. Go ahead and get out there and seize the means of production, my little anarchist friends.
All right, moving on to chapter 2.
This recording is a product of Audio Anarchy. Now, before I get started with this reading, I'd like to issue a bit of a content warning. This chapter contains depictions of violence, sexual violence, slavery, racial violence, and racism. It also features the use of words that are pretty commonly known to be slurs. That said, if you're willing to carry on, carry on. A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. Chapter 2, Drawing the Color Line. A Black American writer, j-sons.
I thought I had looked at this chapter beforehand. Let me just give it a second. Because if it does end up having slurs, as he said, we may have to actually ditch it for tonight. Where is that? Sorry, I'm going to have to quickly scan the text. Hopefully it does not. Drawing the color line. Okay. This chapter does not have the full slur. It does use... Whoops. I didn't mean to do that one. Hold on. It does use an outdated term for black people, but it is not the N-word. So just be aware of that if you're watching or listening it. Oh, that's where I wanted to be. Share this tab instead.
Saunders Redding describes the arrival of a ship in North America in the year 1619. Quote, "Sails furled, flag drooping at her rounded stern, she rode the tide in from the sea. She was a strange ship indeed, by all accounts, a frightening ship, a ship of mystery. Whether she was trader, privateer, or man of war, no one knows. Through her bulwarks, black-mouthed cannon yawned. The flag she flew was Dutch, her crew a motley. Her port of call, an English settlement, Jamestown, in the colony of Virginia. She came, she traded, and shortly afterwards was gone. Probably no ship in modern history has carried a more portentous freight. Her cargo, 20 slaves. There is not a country in world history in which racism has been more important for so long a time as the United States. And the problem of the color line, as W.E.B. Du Bois put it, is still with us. So it is more than a purely historical question to ask, how does it start? And an even more urgent question, how might it end? Or, to put it differently, is it possible for whites and blacks to live together without hatred? If history can help answer these questions, then the beginnings of slavery in North America, a continent where we can trace the coming of the first whites and the first blacks, might supply at least a few clues. Some historians think those first blacks in Virginia were considered as servants, like the white indentured servants brought from Europe, but the strong probability is that, even if they were listed as servants, a more familiar category to the English, they were viewed as being different from white servants, were treated differently, and in fact were slaves. In any case, slavery developed quickly into a regular institution, into the normal labor relation of blacks to whites in the New World. With it developed that special racial feeling, whether hatred or contempt or pity or patronization, that accompanied the inferior position of blacks in America for the next 350 years. That combination of inferior status and derogatory thought we call racism.
So, any institution that lasts for 350 years is bound to leave a mark and not just be wiped away with, the stroke of a pen, or even a war, even a particularly bloody and brutal war. That's not just going to make all of that stuff go away and that all of a sudden everyone's okay. And,
Right. Ending slavery didn't end the discrimination even under color of law.
right, because
So,
Jim Crow became a thing almost immediately. And all the former slaves that actually were given land, because that actually did happen. Some people got their 40 acres. Almost immediately, it was taken back and reapportioned to the former slave owners. So, yeah, all of these things have repercussions through the generations, and it's, I mean, I guess white people have a tendency to think that, all that makes a difference in their life is how well their parents did, perhaps. And if their parents did well, then they have a better chance of doing well. But that's as far back as his history affects anything. It seems to be the common opinion amongst white Americans. But that ignores how many generations it takes to actually build up wealth. How many privileges that are still in effect today. You have to look no further than how we give money to schools, how we decide what money goes to what school. It's all based on districts, which are often even gerrymandered in a way to include people based on race. To this day, there's no law that says, black people have to have less money per student for their schools. But then again, there's no law that says that they have to have equal amount of money per student. In fact, for some reason, we are allowed to discriminate based on geography. And if you can discriminate in school funding based on geography, that means that you can have de facto segregation, de facto racism, even if there's no mention of color in the entire law or ordinance or whatever it may be.
yep. Yep. So long as they're able to keep, drawing those lines along who they'd like to include in their shit, then,
Mhm.
we have a problem. Gerrymandering shouldn't even be allowed. It shouldn't be a lottery of if you live in an area with a higher tax rate for the property
Hmm.
that you get to go to a better school.
No, it should just be divvied up. All the property tax money should go to the state itself, and then reapportioned to school districts based only on the number of students they have, and nothing more. That's the only way to even approach fairness. And then, of course, you have um, unequal treatment among the different states. So you could even go further and say it should all go to the federal government and then be reapportioned to the school districts based on the number of students they have. Um, but yeah, what we have now is a legal form of discrimination. It's that you know it's almost the smoking gun that Ben Shapiro always talks about. How, well, there's no racism written into the laws today, so what's the excuse today? Well, beyond the fact that um, over the generations you can build yourself a really good position and then not let anyone in unless they meet your arbitrary criteria, and with a system that tends to reward the few with the most, um, that means that there's always less positions of power than there are people to fill them. Um, so those few in power can do what they want to keep other people out, you know? And for a long time, they did it legally with redlining. Um, but even that, that ended in, let's see, yeah, I think it legally ended in the late 70s, and the practice itself supposedly was stamped out by the early 80s. But that means that, I myself, a 40-year-old man, could be the first generation to become an adult past redlining had I been born a black guy or a black person. Um, my parents could have experienced redlining for, you know, their early adult life. My parents were born in the 50s, you know, still redlining going on well past the time that they came of age. So it's not that far removed. And that was a legal way of discrimination. The same with racial covenants. Um, in fact, the neighborhood that my parents lived in had a racial covenant against Jewish people up until that was finally outlawed at the federal level. But with racial covenants followed the house too. They followed the property title. So even if you're like, I don't care if I sell to a Jewish person, legally you would have to. And if you, or you would have to not sell to them, I should say. And if you did, they could take your house back. I don't know if it was the bank could take it back or the original property owner, but yeah, until they finally federally outlawed that. Um, so yeah, those things tend to still have effects and reverberations until today.
Right. Hell, even, look at how our electoral process works. We have an electoral college that, operates on these votes, you know, all going to whoever, got the popular vote for the state. And then we add to that the issue with your vote in a rural area counting up to, like, I think it's 65, 70 times as much as a vote in an urban area. Like, if you live in the middle of fucking
Yeah,
nowhere, Iowa, you have
yeah.
far greater say. Your vote has that much greater power than somebody who lives in LA amongst millions of others. That there's more people in that one city than probably your whole state and maybe the next couple of them around you. Um, that was built into the system, and it doesn't say anything about race in those laws. It just says that, oh, well, if you live in this area, in order to give you, quote unquote, in some equality on the federal level, we're going to give your state just as much voting power as the next state, even though you
Mm-hmm.
are a fraction of the population of that state.
Right.
And it was to condense power into the hands of rural white wealthy people who owned the land.
Uh huh. Yeah, it's a holdover from slavery. It was concession back then. I'm sure everyone, at least, was taught about the 3/5 compromise, where black people were counted as 3/5 of a vote, even though they of course themselves couldn't vote. But it was the entire scheme was to give more power to the much less populous, but far wealthier, in fact, southern states, uh, than they otherwise would get if you counted only voters, like actual people that could vote. So that it's no different that the Senate is apportioned that way now. It's all just to give extra power to the smaller, more conservative states than they otherwise would deserve. It makes no sense. I mean, we're supposedly founded on one person, one vote. That's supposed to be what democracy is, that no vote is worth more than another. But here we are
Right.
with
That
the
means we
Senate.
need to get rid of the Electoral College. We need
I
to
was
get
just about to go there. Yeah,
it's
absolutely.
like that is based on racism. It needs to go.
Absolutely is. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And that again, we still see legal discrimination when they, purge voting rolls of certain counties. Um, and when they do all these other things to disenfranchise people, it's not as though they're double counting some votes, or they're, just coming up to them arbitrarily and saying, you are not allowed to vote. They're just, you know purging the voter rolls a few days, or oftentimes within, when it's too late to actually re-register at a new address. They're just purging all of those rolls right before elections, uh, in, in a targeted way, so that they can minimize the black vote. And it goes to not allowing felons to vote in many states, not allowing prisoners to vote in most states. I think Vermont allows prisoners to vote. I don't know if any other ones do. But yeah, this is all de facto racism. It's just that it doesn't say it outright. But the purpose is clear, that, if you take away someone's political power, what little political power they even have, um, and you can do that by slapping them with a felony, well, then guess who they're going to slap with the most felonies? Guess whose neighborhoods they're going to police the most, so they can catch the most people,
Guess where
regardless
else
of.
we see systemic racism?
Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah, yeah. In our policing practice.
Yeah, that's set up that way on purpose,
Hmm.
intentionally.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
another part of that too is slavery was not completely outlawed by the 13th Amendment. It only outlawed personal individual ownership of other people.
Hmm.
It did not outlaw slavery, because
Right.
when your entire community is being targeted by the police and sent to prison at a higher per capita rate, being specifically targeted, and guess what comes with being in prison is doing indentured servitude. Of you're working on a chain gang, you're doing free labor, that is slave labor. We didn't get rid of slavery of black people at fucking all.
Yep. Yeah.
Granted,
Here.
there's other people in prisons too who are also being enslaved, but look who is targeted the most. Indigenous populations and black people are the two highest rates per capita being
Yep.
targeted in the police state.
And that's all because police, their main job, their long-term history of their job has been to protect capital, to protect the owner class. And back when it started, it was slave catchers and slave patrols, so that was to protect literal property, which, because people were literally considered property. And now it's to protect the wealthy owner class by locking up as many poor and non-white people as possible, and legally, systemically disenfranchise them. And hello to Tribunus Plebis Media. Hey, Sean, how's it going tonight? Good to see you. It's been a while. How you been? We are covering People's History of the United States. We're on to Chapter 2 tonight. So yeah, so here is an article too from the Baltimore Sun about how slavery is still legal in the United States and why it needs to end. So there you have that. All right, moving on in the chapter.
Everything in the experience of the first white settlers acted as a pressure for the enslavement of blacks. The Virginians of 1619 were desperate for labor to grow enough food to stay alive. Among them were survivors from the winter of 1609 to 1610, the starving time, when, crazed for want of food, they roamed the woods for nuts and berries, dug up graves to eat the corpses, and died in batches until 500 colonists were reduced to 60. In the journals of the House of Burgesses...
Yeah, the master race of humanity, right? Couldn't even survive in the New World without the help of the native people, and yet turned around and slaughtered them as a policy from that on.
Well, they had to prove to their own fucking egos that they were masters in some way, shape, or form.
Well, they were definitely the masters of slaughtering people wholesale. They're masters of genocide. That's for sure.
Yeah.
Oh.
Fuck no.
Yep. Yep.
Of Virginia is a document of 1619, which tells of the first 12 years of the Jamestown colony. The first settlement had 100 persons, who had one small ladle of barley per meal. When more people arrived, there was even less food. Many of the people lived in cave-like holes dug into the ground, and in the winter of 1609 to 1610, they were, quote, driven through insufferable hunger to eat those things which nature most abhorred, the flesh and excrements of man, as well of our own nation as of an Indian, digged by some out of his grave after he had lain buried 3 days, and wholly devoured him. Others, envying the better state of body of any whom hunger has not yet so much wasted as their own, lay wait and threatened to kill and eat them. One among them...
So they weren't even waiting to cannibalize people at the end. That's how desperate they were. That's how ill-equipped they were to survive in a new land. And I'm sure a lot of that had to do with the noblemen that they had along with them, who probably were not too willing to pitch in and do any of the work necessary to procure food and whatnot. So,
I mean, if you're going to eat anybody, eat the rich. But,
that's a perfect opportunity, right?
Don't dig up fucking 3-day dead body.
Yeah.
Ugh.
Yeah. Although they probably had their own guards. They probably promised people if they would protect them that they would, help them out after the famine was done. So there's always levers the rich can pull to preserve their own asses at the cost of everyone else.
Man.
Right?
Yeah. What the fuck?
Right.
Nope.
Yeah.
Oh.
All right. Let's continue on.
Slew his wife as she slept in his bosom, cut her in pieces, salted her, and fed upon her, till he had clean devoured all parts, saving her head.
Saving her head. Well, that was thoughtful.
A petition by 30 colonists to the House of Burgesses, complaining against the 12-year governorship of Sir Thomas Smith, said, in those 12 years of Sir Thomas Smith, his government, we aver that the colony, for the most part, remained in great want and misery, under most severe and cruel laws. The allowance in those times for a man was only 8 ounces of meal, and half a pint of peas for a day, mouldy, rotten, full of cobwebs and maggots, loathsome to man and not fit for beasts, which forced many to flee for relief to the savage enemy, who, being taken again, were put to sundry deaths, as by hanging, shooting, and breaking upon the wheel. Of whom one for stealing 2 or 3 pints of oatmeal had a bodkin thrust through his tongue, and was tied with a chain to a tree until he starved.
So nice to see that as bad as things are for these colonists, as horrible as the conditions can be for them, they can always inflict worse horrors on the people that were just there surviving next to them and actually doing well.
Dude, real American history is so fucking horrific.
It is. It is.
Fuck. It's rare for me to be at a loss for words, but that's about all I can summation.
I know. It's like, how do you even summon that kind of cruelty if you're literally starving to death in the wilderness, 1,000 miles away from your home? I don't know what level of psychopathy it takes to be able to still do that.
why didn't they go hunting? Like, there's animals every fucking where. Kill
Well,
a
right.
deer.
And they're on the coast. There's probably like clams or mussels or something. There's probably fish. It's the ocean. It doesn't exactly freeze in the winter. Like I know it's
Right?
as far up as Virginia, but yeah, I don't think there's any sea ice that makes it down that far. So they had boats, obviously. What the hell were they doing? What? And if they didn't have the gear to do it ahead of time, why didn't they plan that ahead? They just assumed that they were going to live in the lap of luxury, I suppose, and they found out otherwise.
It's just still befuddling to me. I mean, they could have at least used their brains, and instead of, I don't know, eating somebody who died, maybe using parts of their body to set traps for animals that,
Yeah,
they,
any number of things, sure. Like, yeah, they just didn't seem. It's like, well, there's no market here. I guess we're just going to starve. It's like people that think that food comes from the supermarket or from delivery now, I guess, is
right.
the modern analog to that. And if that didn't happen, I guess those people would starve too, because they would just have no idea where else food would come from or how else to get it.
You'd think they would at least have known how to plant some food and grow it.
Well, yeah, and that too. I mean, they're maybe they were planning on planting all those peas,
They
and
fucked
oats and
up.
stuff. But yeah, definitely, yeah, yeah. I mean, if you're at the point where you're eating your seed crop, then yeah, you screwed up pretty badly. All right, moving on.
Virginians needed labor to grow corn for subsistence, to grow tobacco for export. They had just figured out how to grow tobacco, and in 1617 they sent off the first cargo to England, finding that, like all pleasurable drugs tainted with moral disapproval, it brought a high price. The planters, despite their high religious talk, were not going to ask questions about something so profitable. They couldn't force the Indians to work for them as Columbus had done. They were outnumbered, and while with superior firearms they could massacre Indians, they would face massacre in return. They could not capture them and keep them enslaved. The Indians were tough, resourceful, defiant, and at home in these woods, as the transplanted Englishmen were not. White servants had not yet been brought over in sufficient quantity. Besides, they did not come out of slavery, and did not have to do more than contract their labor for a few years to get their passage and a start in the New World. As for the free white settlers, many of them were skilled craftsmen, or even men of leisure back in England, who were so little inclined to work the land that John Smith, in those early years, had to declare a kind of martial law, organize them into work gangs, and force them into the fields for survival.
There you go. When you get to be rich enough, you won't even work to literally save your own ass.
What the fuck? It's not that hard to grow food. Come on now.
Yeah, they just couldn't bear it. Their pride could not take that level of abuse to be reduced to a common laborer. Had to declare martial law to make rich people work. That's what it takes to make rich people work is martial law.
That's sad.
I doubt it. I doubt it's any different today.
I was just about to say the same thing. It's like, well, we might have to do something from history here and be like, worked for them. Oh, fuck. And they'll be like, but I pushed this pencil so well.
That's right. I commanded other people to do my work for me with grace and style.
He wants me to get dirt on my hands.
Oh, yes.
I'll
Oh,
tell you.
whew. Rather die. And apparently that was literally true. They would rather die.
What the fuck? Yeah.
Yeah, and again, we have that juxtaposition of people that are so arrogant and so utterly convinced of their superiority, well, that they will, commit untold cruelty without a second thought.
Yeah.
And that's all based on their own supposed supremacy, but yet will not lift a spade to save their own lives. It's a strange juxtaposition of arrogance and complete incompetence that you see a lot amongst rich people who are entitled.
We've, like, if they even had a superior set of skills,
Right? Right?
they would have been growing food.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have the means to survive as far as your skill set. I just, what the
Yeah.
It's so frustrating because they really fucking think that they're entitled to having other people do that shit to ensure their survival. And it's like, we don't fucking exist for you.
Well,
Either
and
you throw down or fuck off. Why is it we have socialism for the wealthy?
right. Well, and that's the thing is it's such projection here that the rich forever accuse the poor of being lazy and layabouts, and if they weren't coerced into work, then they never would. That's obviously what was true about them, not the people
Right.
that they were projecting on.
Right. They're fucking describing themselves. They're pointing that finger with three more pointing back at themselves.
Absolutely.
Like,
Absolutely true.
what the fuck, people? Damn it. That fucking attitude still lingers and I can't stand it.
Right. Yeah. And again, this is why the past is history, or why history is important to study, is because you see those patterns continuing till today. You see the systems, the same sorts of systems that rewarded them then, rewarding the same sorts of people today. So, yeah, important, I would say.
Yeah.
There
Dude,
may
so
have
many
been
people
a
are mind fucked about it. Sorry, one last thought. So many people
Yeah,
are
yeah.
still mind fucked about it because they
Oh, yeah.
literally look at people like Elon Musk and be like, look at this self-made man. And it's like,
Right.
self-made my fucking ass. I beg to differ, and so would all of the fucking countless people in South Africa that have been fucking exploited by his family, digging
Yep.
up gemstones.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. And you know, he's the Tony Stark of our generation, who has his name on, I think, 2 patents that have to do with something to do with the door of the Tesla, or some trivial thing like that. Nothing even major about it. And he was also one of, like, I don't know, 5 or 6 people that were on that same patent. So he's basically the kid that screws around the entire class project and just writes his name on the end right before you turn it in without contributing a damn thing. This is the Tony Stark of our era, though. The man who works 16 hours a day because he says so. Like, no one is tracking how much he actually works. He could say he works 24 hours a day, and his relentless cheerleaders would still just eat it up and parrot everything that comes out of his mouth.
Right. They sit around like, look at how hard he works. And it's like, what the fuck are you talking about?
What is he working at doing? Buying things? Wow.
Hiring the right people who have the intellect and skill set and will do the work.
Yeah. Hiring people to union bust at his assembly plants. Yeah, hiring
Yeah.
everyone to do his work for him. That sounds like a tough job.
Poor Elon.
Yeah, poor little rich man.
Elon, if you're watching this, go to
Which I'm sure he is.
www.patreon.com/ for we are many. We have a specific tier for your bitch ass. We can do so much better with your money than you are. So go on that page and sign up and start putting some money into real good work, because we'll actually have, people getting housed and fed with it.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah. But you wouldn't be as much of a free speech warrior if you spent the money that way, Trisha. You know, as if you were purchasing Twitter, saving humanity.
I'm pretty sure we're on the list of people that he wants to ban from Twitter for talking about him.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. As soon as that deal finally goes through, there's going to be, droves of people that are banned without ever doing anything. Yep. All right, let's move on. Let's hear more about the follies of the rich.
kind of frustrated rage at their own ineptitude, at the Indian superiority taking care of themselves, that made the Virginians especially ready to become the masters of slaves.
God.
Edmund Morgan imagines their mood as he writes in his book, American Slavery, American Freedom.
I never really put those pieces together, though, either. I just thought that the first slaves came to the Virginia colonies because that's what people were doing at the time. I didn't realize that these people were so rich and entitled and averse to actually trying to survive on their own that they literally thought it'd be better to enslave people half a world away and bring them over to do the work that they're not willing to do. I didn't know that's how slavery started here. That's pretty amazing.
They're so fucking lazy.
Yes. Yes. I can't possibly plow the field. Bring someone from 2,000 miles away.
Right. Here, I'll pay you all this fucking gold.
Right. Right.
Like, just what the fuck? Again.
Yep. Here we are again. Place where I'm sure we're going to pause quite a bit through this book.
There's going to be a lot of what the fuck in this book.
If you were a colonist, you knew that your technology was superior to the Indians. You knew that you were civilized and they were savages. But your superior technology had proved insufficient to extract anything. The Indians, keeping to themselves, laughed at your superior methods and lived from the land more abundantly and with less labor than you did. And when your own people started deserting in order to live with them, it was too much. So you killed the Indians, tortured them, burned their villages, burned their cornfields. It proved your superiority in spite of your failures. And you gave similar treatment to any...
No, it did not. No. If anything, it's the opposite. You have to go that far to prove a point.
Right. That was straight up fucking jealousy because they didn't know how to fucking survive. And they're like, how dare you be surviving so well here, doing all the shit we're not willing to get off of our fucking lazy asses to do. What?
Yeah. Absolutely that. That proves the superiority.
They're superiorly insecure as fuck.
Yep. Superiorly insecure and along with that, cruel. So.
Yeah.
Right.
Any of your own people who succumbed to their savage ways of life. But you still did not grow much corn. Black slaves were the answer. And it was natural to consider imported blacks as slaves, even if the institution of slavery would not be regularized and legalized for several decades. Because by 1619, 1 million blacks had already been brought from Africa to South America and the Caribbean to the Portuguese and Spanish colonies to work as slaves. 50 years before Columbus, the Portuguese took 10 African blacks to Lisbon. This was the start of a regular trade in slaves. African blacks had been stamped as slave labor for 100 years. So it would have been strange if those 20 blacks forcibly transported to Jamestown and sold as objects to settlers anxious for a steadfast source of labor were considered as anything but slaves. Their helplessness made enslavement easier. The Indians were on their own land. The whites were in their own European culture. The blacks had been torn from their land and culture, forced into a situation where the heritage of language, dress, custom, family relations was bit by bit obliterated, except for the remnants that blacks could hold on to by sheer extraordinary persistence. Was their culture inferior and so subject to easy destruction? Inferior in military capability, yes. Vulnerable to whites with guns and ships, but in no other way. Except that cultures that are different are often taken as inferior, especially when such a judgment is practical and profitable. Even militarily, while the Westerners could secure forts on the African coast, they were unable to subdue the interior and had to come to terms with its chiefs. The African civilization was as advanced in its own way as that of Europe. In certain ways, it was more admirable, but it also included cruelties, hierarchical privilege, and the readiness to sacrifice human lives for religion or profit. It was a civilization of 100 million people, using iron implements and skilled in farming. It had large urban centers and remarkable achievements in weaving, ceramics, sculpture. European travelers in the 16th century were impressed with the African kingdom.
Yeah, and yet look at how they were depicted as again these naked savages who, were completely uncivilized and in need of some European civilization.
It's the mental gymnastics that these Europeans use to justify to themselves treating other people as less than human.
Mm-hmm. Yep, and I like when you pointed out that, as long as there's a profit motive, you're much more willing to believe whatever someone says about another group of people. If there's a chance that you can exploit them and benefit yourself, then yeah.
Fucking colonizers.
Yep.
Kingdoms of Timbuktu and Mali, already stable and organized at a time when European states were just beginning to develop into the modern nation. In 1563, Ramusio, secretary to the rulers in Venice, wrote to the Italian merchants, "Let them go and do business with the king of Timbuktu and Mali, and there is no doubt that they will be well received there, with their ships and their goods, and treated well, and granted the favors that they ask." A Dutch report around 1602 on the West African kingdom of Benin said, "The town seemeth to be very great. When you enter it, you go into a great broad street, not paved, which seemeth to be 7 or 8 times broader than the Warmoes Street in Amsterdam. The houses in this town stand in good order, one close and even with the other, as the houses in Holland stand." The inhabitants of the Guinea coast were described by one traveler around 1680 as, quote, "very civil and good-natured people, easy to be dealt with, condescending to what Europeans require of them in a civil way, and very ready to return double the presents we make them," unquote. Africa had a kind of feudalism, like Europe, based on agriculture, and with hierarchies of lords and vassals, but African feudalism did not come, as did Europe's, out of the slave societies of Greece and Rome, which had destroyed ancient tribal life. In Africa, tribal life was still powerful, and some of its better features, a communal spirit, more kindness in law and punishment, still existed. And because the lords did not have the weapons that European lords had, they could not command obedience as easily. In his book, The African Slave Trade, Basil Davidson contrasts law in the Congo in the early 16th century with law in Portugal and England. In those European countries, where the idea of private property was becoming powerful, theft was punished brutally. In England, even as late as 1740, a child could be hanged for stealing a rag of cotton.
What the
But
fuck?
in the Congo,
Yeah. Yeah, there was a good, what am I thinking of? Philosophy Tube video that talked about English law and its advancement, and they talked about how for most of the written law, most of the time of the written law, rich people could basically just do whatever they felt like to poor people. It was all left up to the whims of either the person who was meting out the punishment or the judge or whatever. There was just like complete leeway in the way that laws were applied and how severe a punishment could be. So
That's just insane, though.
well, of course it is. It makes no logical sense unless you just are utterly convinced of your own superiority to even your own people, as long as they're of a lower class than you.
Right? I mean, there's a lot of stuff that's widely known of, like punishments for cutting off hands for stealing stuff, things like that. But to get the fucking death penalty for it, like that's, I mean, both are fucking horrendous. It's just
Right.
I'd never heard of anybody being put to death for stealing a piece of cotton.
Right, and that's the thing when they're trying to make Middle Eastern cultures look bad and savage and backward. They talk about getting your hand sliced off for stealing something at the marketplace. Well, at the same time, much worse punishments could have been happening in their own backyard.
Right. Right. What the fuck?
Ridiculous.
So,
Yep.
literal, definitive overkill.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. How could anyone justify that sort of a punishment for such a little thing from a child. Like,
Right.
yeah,
If
yeah.
if it's stealing something, it's because they're in need. If anything, they should have been stopping and
Well,
going,
sure.
"What can I do to help?"
Well, yeah, yeah. If they were an actual civilized people that had,
Mm,
their uh, logic and thoughts ruling over their emotions, as they claim to have been, but yeah, that was not the actual case.
Ago, communal life persisted. The idea of having private property was a strange one, and thefts were punished with fines or various degrees of servitude. A Congolese leader told of the Portuguese legal codes, asked a Portuguese once teasingly, "What is the penalty in Portugal for anyone who puts his feet on the ground?" Slavery existed in the African states, and it was sometimes used by Europeans to justify their own slave trade. But as Davidson points out, the, quote, slaves, unquote, of Africa were more like the serfs of Europe. In other words, like most of the population of Europe. It was a harsh servitude, but they had rights, which slaves brought to America did not have, and they were, quote, altogether different from the human cattle of the slave ships and the American plantations.
And this is an important point to always bring up when people are trying to do apologia for the American slave trade, as though, oh, every culture in the world had slavery, and it's, trying to make it seem as though it was all equal, and it certainly was not in the Americas. That went far beyond anything that had ever existed before and would ever exist afterward. The idea of people being literal property forever, as well as their descendants, did not come into play in any other sort of code that involves slavery. So, yeah, that's the unique cruelty of the Americas, or of the colonists in the Americas.
yeah.
Unquote. In the Ashanti Kingdom of West Africa, one observer noted that, quote, a slave might marry, own property, himself own a slave, swear an oath, be a competent witness, and ultimately become heir to his master. An Ashanti slave, 9 cases out of 10, possibly became an adopted member of the family, and in time, his descendants so merged and intermarried with the owner's kinsmen that only a few would know their origin.
So once again, these people that are trying to wash away American slavery will always say, oh, but they never were the first ones to enslave the people. It was always the Africans themselves. And, they'll blame the Middle Eastern slave trade and all that sort of thing. And say that because they originally enslaved the people, that they were somehow ultimately responsible for it, which is bullshit. I mean, if you were to buy a slave today, even if you didn't enslave that person, you would be equally culpable for their enslavement. But beyond that, again, we're seeing a very different conception of what slavery even is in these places that these slaves are originating from. Nowhere near as brutal. Still terrible. Still absolutely wrong, but not to near the same degree that American slavery was.
Right. Even Rome's form of slavery didn't fucking compare in brutality to American slavery, and Rome had the motherfucking coliseums
Oh
making
yeah.
prisoners fucking fight to the death,
Oh yeah.
and that was still a better way to go out.
Right. Yeah. Because those uh, yeah, those people were treated better still. It's ridiculous.
And even they could at least fucking buy their freedom if they did well, if they lived long enough fighting as a gladiator for years and got an opportunity, they could oftentimes buy their freedom.
Exactly. Yeah. So even in those dire circumstances, there still would be pathways out of it potentially. Not so the case in American slavery. Not even through death, because your children would end up being slaves too. And David Evans says American slavery was a perversion of the original concept of slavery. And yeah, it was like ultra slavery. I mean, there really almost even needs to be, I guess, chattel slavery is the modifier that we tend to put on it to distinguish it, but that doesn't even seem to have the magnitude of just how much worse it was than the rest of the world's conception of it.
One slave trader, John Newton, who later became an anti-slavery leader, wrote about the people of what is now Sierra Leone, quote, "The state of slavery among these wild, barbarous people, as we esteem them, is much milder than in our colonies. For, as on the one hand they have no land in high cultivation like our West India plantations, and therefore no call for that excessive, unintermitted labor which exhausts our slaves, so, on the other hand, no man is permitted to draw blood, even from a slave." African slavery is hardly to be praised, but it was far different from plantation or mining slavery in the Americas, which was lifelong, morally crippling, destructive of family ties, without hope of any future. African slavery lacked two elements that made American slavery the most cruel form of slavery in history.
Yep.
The frenzy for limitless profit that comes from capitalistic agriculture, the reduction of the slave to less than human status by the use of racial hatred with that relentless clarity based on color, where white was master, black was slave. In fact, it was because they came from a settled culture of tribal customs and family ties, of communal life and traditional ritual, that African blacks found themselves especially helpless when removed from this. They were captured in the interior, frequently by blacks caught up in the slave trade themselves, sold on the coast, then shoved into pens with blacks of other tribes, often speaking different languages. The conditions of capture and sale were crushing affirmations to the black African of his helplessness in the face of superior force. The marches to the coast, sometimes for 1,000 miles, with people shackled around the neck under whip and gun, were death marches, in which 2 of every 5 blacks died. On the coast, they were kept in cages until they were picked and sold. One John Barbet, at the end of the 17th century, described these cages on the Gold Coast. "As the slaves come down to Feeder from the inland country, they are put into a booth or prison near the beach, and when the Europeans are to receive them, they are brought out onto a large plain where the ship's surgeons examine every part of them, to the smallest member, men and women being stark naked. Some are allowed good, and some are set on one side, marked on the breast with a red-hot iron, imprinting the mark of the French, English, or Dutch companies. The branded slaves after this are returned to their former booths, where they await shipment, sometimes 10 to 15 days. Then they were packed aboard the slave ships, in spaces not much bigger than coffins, chained together in the dark, wet slime of the ship's bottom, choking in the stench of their own excrement.
Content warning again. This is going to get really bad. Just incredibly cruel, inhumane conditions are about to be described. So, here we go.
Of the time described the conditions. The height, sometimes, between decks was only 18 inches, so that the unfortunate human beings could not turn around, or even on their sides, the elevation being less than the breadth of their shoulders. And here they are usually chained to the decks by the neck and legs. In such a place, the sense of misery and suffocation is so great that the Negroes are driven to frenzy. On one occasion, hearing a great noise from below decks where the blacks were chained together, the sailors opened the hatches and found the slaves in different stages of suffocation, many dead, some having killed others in desperate attempts to breathe. Slaves often jumped overboard to drown rather than continue their suffering. To one observer, a slave deck was, quote, so covered with blood and mucus that it resembled a slaughterhouse, unquote. Under these conditions, perhaps one of every 3 blacks transported overseas died. But the huge profits, often double the investment on one trip, made it worthwhile for the slave trader, and so the blacks were packed into the holds like fish. First, the Dutch, then the English dominated the slave trade. By 1795, Liverpool had more than 100 ships carrying slaves and accounted for half of all the European slave trade. Some Americans in New England entered the business, and in 1637, the first American slave ship, the Desire, sailed from Marblehead. Its holds were partitioned into racks, 2 feet by 6 feet, with leg irons and bars. By 1800, 10 to 15 million blacks had been transported as slaves to the Americas, representing perhaps 1/3 of those originally seized in Africa. It is roughly estimated that Africa lost 50 million human beings to death and slavery in those centuries we call the beginnings of modern Western civilization, at the hands of slave traders and plantation owners in Western Europe and America, the countries deemed the most advanced in the world.
Some start to Western civilization there, huh?
Yeah. That. And people like to talk about it as if, oh, that was a positive of, slavery got shit done. And it's like, no, none of this is okay. It's not
No.
fucking okay. There's nothing like that.
Not by a long stretch.
I don't like the world would be better off without the industrialization and things like that that ended up coming as a result of all of the slave labor building every fucking thing here.
Yeah. As though that would ever be, just the price you have to pay for progress of a civilization. Absolutely ludicrous claim. That's only the price you have to pay if only a handful of people are in charge and none of them want to do any work themselves, and they really don't care about, what means it takes to get their ends. That's the price you pay then. But otherwise, it doesn't have to go that way.
Right.
For progress.
I find it really fucking just audacious for somebody to have that privileged ass fucking perspective of it.
Yeah.
As
Absolutely.
if there's anything that could ever justify it.
Yeah. No, there is no justification. There's no justification for any slavery, but especially no justification for chattel slavery. Yeah. So David Evans says, as time went on in America, slavery became worse and worse. It started off more similar to African slavery and where people could buy their way out. But then in America, they didn't want any free black people. Whoa. Hey, Alyosha, thank you so much for the raid. Or for the host, whatever. Yeah, raid, I guess. Yeah, raided. All right. Thank you so much, Alyosha, for the raid. Let me shout you out real quick, and then I'll get back to the David's comment. All right, so everyone go check out Alyosha, really great streamer. Covers national U.S. politics quite a bit. Always a fun time on their stream. So anyway, back to David's comment. We'll bring it up on the big screen there. So, it doesn't even cover the entire comment. I'll just have to read it myself. So they didn't want any free black people in the Americas. So they had to make slavery more and more destructive, or it would have been normal for them to be free eventually, and pretty much everywhere. And in the end, even some of the Confederates were asking themselves why they were turning themselves into animals in order to maintain slavery. Yep. That's a good question. That's a good question. And I mean, even at the time of the American Civil War, most of the people in the South didn't own any slaves. The vast majority did not. It was all a system for the benefit of the very, very, very few. And at that point, even there'd been a lot of consolidation of operations. So it was even less people than when it started out in the South. So yeah, why the Confederates felt the need to go to war for people that didn't care about them and didn't need them at all to make their profit. Yeah, I don't know. It is a mystery.
Yeah.
Hey, Alex and Susie, good to see you. Hey, Susie Foreman as well. Good to have you on. Glad to see you again. We're covering a heavy topic right now, so just be forewarned. We're in the thick of the American slave trade. So there's graphic depictions of incredible human cruelty ahead. So just fair warning.
In the year 1610, A Catholic priest in the Americas named Father Sandoval wrote back to a church functionary in Europe to ask if the capture, transport, and enslavement of African blacks was legal by church doctrine. A letter dated March 12, 1610, from Brother Luis Brandeon to Father Sandoval gives the answer. Your Reverence writes me that you would like to know whether the Negroes who are sent to your parts have been legally captured. To this I reply that I think your Reverence should have no scruples on this point, because this is a matter which has been questioned by the Board of Conscience in Lisbon, and all its members are learned and conscientious men. Nor did the bishops who were in Sao Tome, Cape Verde, and here in Loando, all learned and virtuous men, find fault with it. We have been here ourselves for 40
Oops, didn't mean to pause it there.
years, and there have been among us very learned fathers. Never did they consider the trade as illicit. Therefore, we and the fathers of Brazil buy these slaves for our service without any scruple.
Without any scruple, that's a good way of putting it.
Problem is, they actually used a lot of the Bible to justify slavery, including the fucking ministry that they forced their slaves to undergo to, and mind-fucking and indoctrinating slaves into Christianity by showing them this book of bullshit saying, see here, it says it's okay for me to enslave you, and here's even the rules about the proper ways I can kill you.
Yep. Yeah. So again, another theme that runs till today is conservatives using their religious text to justify what they already believe and want to do, and just then being able to do it with a clear conscience from their standpoint.
They're sociopathic.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I don't think they do their religion any service by picking apart, cherry picking all their favorite passages to justify being incredibly cruel to one another. Seems to go against everything that Jesus ever was quoted as having said, at the very least. You definitely have to go back to some Old Testament stuff to even find passages about slavery. I don't think there's any slavery in the New Testament. Yeah.
Sorry, I was raised in that mindfuck. Leviticus and Deuteronomy.
So there you go.
Book of the law.
And then supposedly Christ was sacrificed in order to make a new covenant, meaning that you didn't have to follow all these old rules anymore. God was making a new covenant with you through the sacrifice of his son. So the idea that you would even use any part of the Old Testament as anything more than, backdrop to the main event of your religion, it makes absolutely no sense.
Therein lies the difference between quote unquote Christians and people who are Christ-like.
Yeah.
There is a world of difference. It's befuddling even to point out to them, like, excuse me, you're eating shrimp and lobster and you're wearing clothing of mixed fibers. Oh, fuck, you're left-handed. You're going to go to hell for that. You want to ignore those laws that were listed in the same two books of bullshit of Leviticus and Deuteronomy.
Yeah.
You want to forget about that for yourself, but point the finger at somebody with a different shade of pigment, or point the finger at somebody with a different sexuality. And, excuse me, thought that fucking cleansing of the blood was washing away all of that shit. What happened to your new covenant?
Yeah, right. And I seem to remember there was even some rule in the Bible where if someone defamed their parents, you were allowed to kill them, or you had to kill them. There's a lot of stuff about stoning people to death for, their transgressions of virtue. So, yeah, it's funny how all that stuff just gets pushed aside. And yet, whatever it is you want to do today that is morally questionable, well, hey, we'll just fish that part back out and treat it as the one and only way to interpret things.
A few years ago, Christian out west fucked around and found out his underage daughter had been raped by a guy in his 20s, and he forced her to marry the guy.
Oh, fuck.
Yeah. And she ended up getting away from him.
Thank
There
goodness.
was charges pressed against both of them. And the dad tried using as a defense in court, but I just did what the Bible told me to do. It didn't fly.
Yeah, that's good. There would have been times in U.S. law where that would have been perfectly acceptable.
Right. But it's like how you can sit there and be like, yeah, well, this archaic book says, you know,
I
make
know.
it frames it as make the man marry her so that he has to take care of any child that would have come from the rape, and that child would then have inheritance, etc. No, you're punishing your daughter by making her have to put up with an abuser who fucking assaulted her for the
Yeah.
rest of her life, to
Yeah.
continue to be assaulted by this person.
Yeah.
There's
Wow.
nothing ethical or moral about that
No.
at all.
No. Oh, that is horrifying.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Yeah. Yup.
This is why I get frustrated with people who are fundamentalist and
Absolutely.
want to go by every fucking letter of the book. And it's like, you're making shit worse because you're trying to make use of things that don't have an application in modern day society. They really shouldn't have had one then.
Right. Well, and there's a really I don't know what you'd even call it, like unfortunate at the very least, but really problematic practice amongst especially fundamentalist Christians where they don't even read the Bible that much. They just rely on their holy person, whatever it was, to interpret it for them, and to them that's an act of faith.
Yeah,
That proves their devotion to God because they're putting all their trust in this one divine interpreter. So, and you wonder that somehow it gets interpreted in really twisted ways to justify horrible things amongst
right.
these fundamentalist people.
And it seems that like the ones who do bother to read, they're only reading the selections the pastor was talking about this week.
Exactly.
You know, if they really read it from cover to cover, they would probably, you know, for one, need to shit their pantaloons,
Yeah.
and, it's just like if you really read all of it, you would be going, what the fuck, at so many
Yeah.
parts that you would have to start to question it.
Yeah. 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 I mean, at the very least, you'd be giving up most of your worldly possessions and living a chaste life um, in humbleness or whatever, and never seeking any of the things that the prosperity gospel preachers talk about. Like that would just be right out if you read the entire thing. So yeah, kind of funny.
Yeah. And then there's motherfuckers on TV with the audacity. Okay, like Creflo Dollar. The motherfucker calls himself Dollar.
It's not a red flag to people, I guess.
It is to me.
Well, yeah,
Um,
it would be to me as well.
see, Blot's back. Hi, Blot.
Hey, Blatt, how you doing? Um, yeah, great. Blatt says, I'm grateful to have the background to confront my neighbors with scripture when they say silly things. If only it were just silly things that they think are backed up by the Bible, but it's not a time investment I would recommend for most folk. Yeah, right, because they want to believe what they believe. They feel very comforted. It's a core part of their identity, and so any threat to it is a threat to their identity. It's a threat to their entire person. Um, so that tends to be the case with people that get really fundamentalist about anything or get into cults or whatever. Just make one thing their entire personality that can never ever be questioned. Otherwise, it's questioning their existence. Yeah, I don't envy anyone who tries to take up that cause. And David says, as per the Bible, a baby is not alive until it takes the breath of air. That's true. Yeah, that says many places in the Bible. So
Yep.
there's even you're probably about to bring it up too. The only description of abortion in the Bible is how to do it to prove that you have not been unfaithful to your husband. So the rabbi administers the abortion-inducing drugs, and if you save the baby, well, I guess you weren't unfaithful after all. But if it dies, or the fetus, I should say, not the baby, but if the fetus dies, then it proves that you were unfaithful. So
Right.
that's the
And
only
it's
mention of it.
it's extra horrible because it's not even by her choice; it's being forced.
Right, it's forced abortion. Which, yeah, I can get behind outlawing that sort of a thing. No one should be forced to have an abortion, but likewise, no one should be forced to give birth. So that seems
Right.
pretty complimentary, those standards.
Right. And coming back full circle to the slavery issue, if you don't own your own fucking body, we have a problem.
Right. It's a pretty fundamental thing to
My God, it's-
building up any sort of human rights is, yeah,
That seems like the most
Bodily
basic
autonomy,
root of all ethical rights.
yeah, right. Bodily
That
autonomy.
you are your own.
Yeah.
Bodily agency
Yeah.
fucking matters.
Yeah, well, and that you are not even an object that can or cannot be owned. You are beyond objectivity. That's at the root of bodily autonomy as well. That's something that right libertarians seem to stumble with quite a bit, because they think that if you can own yourself, well, then you can also sell yourself into slavery, or you can sell your children into slavery. There's people like Murray Rothbard who are completely fine with that sort of shit.
It's not how that works.
No, I agree. It's not how that works. But, you know,
It's not like you receive a deed of sale from your parents for you to own yourself when you come of age as an adult and can then sell yourself. You're not
Exactly.
a car.
no, you're a living, breathing thing. Yeah, definitely. So Blatt says the concept that there are things that can't be bought or sold conflicts with the core of capitalist ideology. Well, yeah, that's true too. Capitalists hate when things are not commodified already, so they will find a way to make it commodified. You know, they will cut down the tree in order to build you the shade that you need to sit out in the field.
Yep.
All right, let's move on a little bit more. Probably only cover about 5 more minutes of the text tonight, and then I got to get going. So we'll do that.
With all of this, the desperation of Jamestown settlers for labor, the impossibility of using Indians, and the difficulty of using whites, the availability of blacks offered in greater and greater numbers by profit-seeking dealers in human flesh, and with such blacks possible to control because they had just gone through an ordeal which, if it did not kill them, must have left them in a state of psychic and physical helplessness, is it any wonder that such blacks were ripe for enslavement?
Yeah.
And under these conditions, even if some blacks might have been considered servants, would blacks be treated the same as white servants?
Nope.
The evidence from the court records of colonial Virginia shows that in 1630, a white man named Hugh Davis was ordered, quote, to be soundly whipped for abusing himself by defiling his body in lying with a Negro, unquote. 10 years later...
That's an odd one there.
Yeah.
He had to punish himself for defiling his own body by lying with a black person. Okay. All right.
Everyone should have punished him for committing rape. How about that?
Well, yeah, that probably would have been the better judgment to hand down. But I guess when you literally view certain people as chattel, then you're viewing anyone having sex with them as having sex with animals, because they were viewed as animals. So it's
Go home and flog yourself.
so go home and flog yourself, because yeah, just like there's laws against bestiality, if you consider an entire people beasts of burden, literally, then yeah, that's the only way that sort of a law would have any, I mean, I guess there's not even sense to it, but it's the only way I could make sense of why that would be. Just pretty gross. It's pretty gross. I feel pretty icky just thinking through that whole thing.
Right. Man, what the fuck is wrong with these people?
That's what I keep saying. What the hell?
Just, god damn it.
Right. It's like every time I think, well, this has to be the most depraved and twisted thing that no one could possibly justify, and yet they've done it. I guess we've hit the height, but then it just keeps going, and there's a new twist, and yep.
What the fuck?
What the fuck? Absolutely true. But yeah, one thing I did want to point out though is that I really like how Howard Zinn uses all these primary texts. So he's not just spinning his own narrative here. He's going to the court records, which, I mean, if there's going to be any somewhat accurate record of a people and their doings, it's going to be in the court system. It's going to have something to do with the law. Of course, they're going to have their own bias applied to that, but we can have the best record of the best possible record of what transpired by looking at things like court records and tax documents and stuff like that. So I like that he uses that a lot because it makes his case all that much more strong. So all these people that cry about CRT and how it makes the kids hate themselves, and it's all just a pack of lies about how horrible the United States was and how they're it's all been twisted and taken out of context. Well, no, it's not as though he's just speaking off the cuff. Here's the primary sources that he used. So
Right. That's the thing. Like, what's already being taught is what was twisted. It was whitewashed. It's bullshit.
Right.
It's not fucking true.
mhm.
The real truth of it is horrifying, and that's the
Yeah.
whole
Very
fucking
unpleasant.
why we need honesty about this shit,
Right.
so people can fucking learn from it and at least have an opportunity to do better.
Yeah.
Not be going around fucking abiding by the shit still flying in underhanded ways with systemic racism that they don't even fucking recognize because they don't know
That's right.
what its effects are and where it comes from.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And when you've been taught your entire life this whitewashed version of history, then your knee-jerk reaction is always to be like, well, no, that couldn't have been your story of of police brutality or unfair treatment in the courts or whatever it is, just having extra struggles to make it in society. That must not be true. That's always the knee-jerk reaction because they've been primed that way. So I think, yeah, exactly. Once you're undoing that priming, once you come to terms with the idea that yes, colonialism is an evil, it just is, and that human beings, are capable of doing the things that are being described, then it's not such a stretch to today think that maybe police target black people or black men specifically more often than anyone else, or that juries do. So
That when you're supposed to have a legal right to a jury of your peers, you know, how is it okay when that lack of representation is what's happening in the juries, where you're looking around, you're not seeing people who are your peers, you're seeing, people who are of completely different demographics in most
mhm.
cases.
Yeah,
And
well,
it's
mostly white people. Let's just say it how it is. Mostly white people are juries.
yes.
But also too, even with that, they've found that even among black jurors, there is bias against black defendants. They found that you
Especially if
take
there's a class difference.
well, yeah, but like I'm just saying overall, that like jurors, even black jurors, tend to convict black people with the same prior convictions, who've done the same crime that they're being tried as, all the same sorts of circumstances. Everything is one to one. They still, even the black people, end up convicting the black defendants more often, and it's because of this institutional bias that
Right.
gets ingrained into people. You don't even notice it anymore.
Right.
Um,
It's been part of the indoctrination from the fucking start. So
mm-hmm.
it's no longer just planting that seed in, white people's minds. It's planting it in everyone's minds who doesn't unfuck their mind. If you're not getting a real education about these things to be aware of it and be able to recognize those things like, oh shit, red flag, that's that's a falsehood. That's some indoctrination right there. And see how it's even framed psychologically of how it's being used. That type of propaganda of, literally steering your frame of thought into self-loathing that you don't even recognize as self-loathing.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's the part of it. It's you don't even recognize it anymore. It just so melds into the background and the fabric of your everyday life that you don't even know that it's happening. But
Right.
that's what these sorts of books do, is they pull you up out of that. They shake you out of your stupor and they make you actually see things for the first time. It's like those what were those magic glasses from what was that sci-fi movie? I can't think of it. Them or something like that. Oh, was it? Dang it! It was on the tip of my tongue. Anyway, there's a sci-fi movie where this guy gets these magic glasses and then he puts them on and he can see that they live. Ah, I was so close. They live, yeah. And he can see that everything is consume, obey, all these hidden messages in society. So that's what books like this do, is they give you that sight to actually see things that you otherwise, yeah, thank you, Ali, as well, that you otherwise might not even take notice of. Um, so yeah, that's why I'm grateful for stuff like this.
Yep. Takes the blinders off.
There you go. That's a good way of putting it. Absolutely. Let's see.
Fox News glasses. Yes. Oh shit. Ain't that the fucking truth?
Absolutely true, Ali.
Oh man, I needed that laugh. Thank you. Fuck.
Right.
Oh, that's great. That. That.
Nice.
Oh God, they're so tainted. Those glasses, they skew everything in such a fucked up manner. Completely block out sight to most things. Just a tiny sliver of truth in there somewhere to try to legitimize the bullshit.
Yep.
God.
Yep. Yeah,
Ah,
absolutely. Absolutely.
funhouse glasses.
Absolutely. All right. Well, I think this is where we're going to have to leave it tonight. Um, looks like we actually have enough people to do a raid on Twitch for the first time in a while. So thank you all for joining. Please stick with for the raid. Thank you, Trisha, once again for joining. It's been a blast as usual.
Thank you
Um,
for having me.
yeah,
Love it
absolutely.
always.
And Trisha is part of For We Are Many, so definitely go check out forwearemany.org. Um, I'll even put that in the chat as well.
Awesome. Thank you. You can find us on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter. Uh, oh goodness,
Yeah.
Instagram. We're building the Instagram. We also just made a Discord that we've got a special part of that is just for our patrons. Um, we're going to eventually open up some more parts that are, for our followers otherwise too. But yeah,
Yeah, it's awesome. Awesome to see you guys putting together cool stuff again. Um, so yeah. Yeah, did you want to do that combat liberalism this Wednesday, Trisha? We had talked about that before. You want to
hell
come
yeah,
back this Wednesday and do that? So
definitely.
yeah. Tune back into this show. Trisha will be back and we'll do combat liberalism by Mao Zedong on Wednesday at around the same time. So 8 o'clock Eastern Time, 7 o'clock Central. And now we are going to raid into uh, Duma Damu, who is formerly known as Joe Lewis. I guess he's still going by Joe Lewis in this debate panel that he's on, but it looks like a cool debate panel. They're talking about. I'm not actually sure what they're talking about right now, but probably current events. That's what he tends to do. Really great show, really great station. So go and check him out. Here's the link for all of those of you who are not joining me on Twitch or watching later. There's the way that you can go check out his channel. And otherwise, I will say goodnight to you, Trish. And yeah,
Thank you for having me.
you're welcome. And all right, see you next time. And then we will start the raid right now. Let me just start the raid. So please join me for the raid. It does help out my standing in the Twitch community. Here we go.